If I prefer.
That's from Romeo and Juliet, Zeffirelli's film production. It's the love song when Juliet and Romeo meet for the first time, and it's love at first sight. You would call that scene one of the most moving scenes in all of literature.
If I profane with my unworthiest hand this holy shrine, the gentle sin is this: my lips, two blushing pilgrims ready stand to smooth the rough touch with a gentle kiss.
Good pilgrim.
I was thinking about how long I've been involved. I've been involved now, I think, around 60 years. I started actually in high school. My high school basketball coach, a man I greatly admired, who was one of my mentors, taught me. I had my first experience with him with Julius Caesar. I think I was a sophomore in high school at the time. But since that time, I got involved then with a very active Shakespearean director in college. I went to Edinburgh State College. It's now Edinburgh State University. And he put on Shakespeare every year. He had at least one or two Shakespeare productions, and they were very well done. But I got into then teaching, and having a teaching career that spanned about 30 years, I taught Shakespeare over those years, several plays every year, and I found myself so fascinated that I would add more and more plays as the students would respond to it. I remember teaching Hamlet any number of years and trying to find new ways to view it, new ways to present it, to keep myself interested. And so I got to know Hamlet very, very well. And the same thing is true with Macbeth, and the same thing is true with Othello, which I taught for a goodly number of years.
As you and I know well, we are in a crisis period in American history, a serious one since the essentially false flag 9/11 event. And sometimes one wonders, why study the classics? Why not study contemporary reality? What's in it for us? Why are the classics important? Why were they important to Shakespeare as a student? And why is Shakespeare important to us?
Well, classics, of course, give us a much better sense of the world and a better sense of ourselves. They're the foundation. They're our essential humanity. I think it's important to live in more than one period of history so as not to be blinded by your own generation. And if you study Shakespeare, you study the Greeks, you're essentially living in another time. And that becomes a way of measuring, a template which enables you to view your own age a little differently and to maybe be able to step out of your own age and see the human experience from another point of view.
We learn as students from the plots, the predicaments, and the characterizations of people. For example, Hotspur and what he means, and Hamlet and his dilemma. How else would you say contemporary youth, high school, and so forth, get that sense of an art that can hold a mirror up to nature?
Well, that's kind of a cryptic, that's kind of a difficult question. It takes them out of themselves and puts them into another character and into another historical period and puts them into another event or series of events. It basically flexes the imagination, and it requires that you explore other dimensions than your own narrow world. You get into other aspects of human experience that way.
as a student, as an actor, an adult actor of Shakespeare, did that afford you a way to, did you understand what you were doing? And how has your attitude toward those plays and characters changed over the years?
Well, I probably didn't understand very much in the beginning, but as time evolved and as you search for the soul of a character, you find yourself applying aspects of the play and aspects of your own experience, and slowly over a period of time, as you grow into the character and as you continue to act, you grow further and further into the character, and you see more and more how different things apply. I know in creating the character of the porter as an adult, I found that was probably my greatest learning experience. That and playing Don Armado in Love's Labour's Lost, I came away with the feeling, well, Shakespeare had to have played this role himself. I can't imagine anyone else having done it. And then, of course, I came across the chess portrait, which shows Shakespeare in Don Armado costume, in a Spanish costume. And out of those adult investigations into the character, I found that I was able to enrich the substance of the character much more than I had been able to as a younger man. The richer your own experience, the more you bring to the character, and the richer you're involved in Shakespeare, the more you bring to the character. I think that's basically what happened. I think that's what happened with me. It's unfortunate. Shakespeare is beginning to take something of a back seat. The classics are being second-handed now, and we've gotten into a whole other range of studies, which some of which I frankly I don't understand. Frankly, I can't understand why we aren't studying the great thinkers, the great writers, the great dramatists, the great playwrights. Why we're doing what we're doing right now. It doesn't make enough of sense. That background seems to me to be so important as a foundation upon which to build a life and to build a human experience.
Isn't it a part of the dumbing down of the culture? I mean, essentially
that's what's happening. That's what's being done. That and of course, along with the principle of planned obsolescence that's built into the culture. The dumbing down and the planned obsolescence basically are undermining many of our most fundamental values.
To return to Shakespeare's time and the span of life that he experienced and what was going on in Elizabethan England, because it was a really tumultuous time, a time of executions, drawing and quartering, attack on the Catholics, real war internally. What was it like?
It was really a dark time. It was an age in which I think no one felt safe. It was an age of paranoia, and I think Shakespeare makes that very clear with the play Hamlet, in which Hamlet states, "The time is out of joint. Oh, cursed spite that I was ever born to set it right." The whole age has been undermined. The security of the age, the foundation of basic trust has been undermined by virtue of this witch hunt that was going on, both with witches generally and Catholics in particular. And Shakespeare was very much involved in that, caught up in that, and I see his plays as an attempt to transcend that neurosis, or psychosis actually it was, of the Elizabethan and the Jacobean ages. That leads me to my what I consider to be one of my major discoveries, the only theme I've been able to find that applies universally throughout Shakespeare, that is the poems as well as the plays, and that is the theme of the stolen kingdom. You'll find if you look at the poems, and you look at it metaphorically, the theme, when you look at the plays and you look at the poems, you find that that's the only consistent theme that's woven throughout his entire body of work. And I was kind of elated to discover that. No one else has come forward with that as a theme. They look at individual plays with individual themes, but they don't pay much attention to, or they don't attempt to grasp his overall intention. And that becomes the question: what's Shakespeare's overall intention? And I see his overall intention to break down, to define, and transcend the psychological damage born of a stolen kingdom. Shakespeare is living into a kingdom, in a kingdom where that's been stolen from the security and the well-being of those two ages brought together. The Elizabethan age and the Jacobean age are basically undermined and rendered as basically paranoid by virtue of this ongoing witch hunt where no one feels safe. And the execution theater is part of that. I call it the execution theater. And I think that explains how Titus Andronicus came into being and why it was such a popular play. Shakespeare's intention and purpose and his need was to transfer the execution theater, which was basically entire families watching drawings and quarterings, and moving it to the public arena, to the aristocrats, to the groundlings, to royalty, to hold it in effect a mirror up to nature, so that they could see and transcend the entrapment, the psychological shock of the execution theater. I think that explains how how Shakespeare came to write Titus and Andronicus.
That being one of his earliest plays.
One of his very earliest plays. He basically took the atrocities that were ruling the time and put them on stage, and then began the process of healing through comedy and tragedy and history of the age in which they lived. And you'll find that in virtually all of his major plays. You find it's everywhere. It's universally written in the poems. For instance, if you get into The Rape of Lucrece, you find what's been stolen there is love and family and a marriage. One of the things that incited that discovery was the fact that I had felt that a recent election had been stolen, that had been incorrectly or criminally seized by authority and redirected another way. And then I saw what happened to the culture as a result of that, and I thought, my God, it's almost a reliving of Hamlet. You have here a kingdom that has been stolen, and that kind of insecurity, that doubt then ripples all the way through the society. You could say the same thing about the Kennedy assassination and the psychological effects of that. A kind of universal paranoia takes hold. You can jump all the way back to Oedipus the King then, if you want to put it into another dramatic event and another historical period. If you recall, in Oedipus the King, Oedipus has committed a crime, and that crime Tiresias the prophet tells him he is responsible for, and the entire city-state of Thebes is basically a poisoned society. And Shakespeare's theme of the poisoned kingdom could very easily be extrapolated from Oedipus the King, and that poisoned society is a result of him having accidentally murdered his father and married his mother. When he discovers that, of course, he blinds himself, puts out his own eyes, indicating our own blindness in our inability to recognize that war, and then you jump back to Homer. And you find that Homer makes very clear the stolen kingdom happens to be Helen of Troy that provokes that entire war and the destruction. And then you find eventually Odysseus managing the journey back from war to peace. He manages to get back to Ithaca, where his kingdom is being threatened to be sold by the suitors, and he manages to slay the suitors and regain his kingdom and his wife Penelope. So the theme is in ancient Greek literature, it's in Shakespeare, the Elizabethan age, and we see it now being acted out here in the 20th century. I think that profound connection just sort of came together. What do you call it? Synchronicity.
It's a theme that repeats itself over and over, because essentially if the kingdom is stolen, if the population isn't alert to the fact that it has been stolen.
Exactly, and every war is essentially a stolen kingdom for someone. Mm-hmm. Their kingdom is being stolen from them, whether it's a justifiable war or not. War is always based on and ultimately ends up, and I don't happen to believe there's such a thing as a just war. The minute one person, the innocent person, is slain, that war becomes unjust. You can't have a war without it becoming ultimately, whether it begins, if you think, with a just principle, it cannot never remain a just war because it always slays the innocent. I'm inclined almost to believe that maybe that's the original intention of war, if you trace it to its foundations, the destruction of the innocent. Anyway, the theme, the stolen kingdom, is in virtually every one of Shakespeare's works. Even the sonnets deals with the theme of the stolen kingdom. If you search around in the sonnets and say, well, where does it apply, you'll find that the principle applies. It's the broad application that drives the motor, the engine of the sonnets, and the love and unrequited love and stolen love and so on.
Well, perhaps you've given one of the best answers to why Shakespeare is being phased out, and essentially, except for exotic movies and occasional, from our public education, to examine what this notion of stolen kingdom and one's own time, and to the degrees one's own sovereignty has been stolen.
It's awfully hard to see the kingdom if you have it in front of you constantly, the reminder that, hey, stolen kingdoms, poison people, poison societies, create a paranoid society, create a paranoid people. It's very difficult. And so Shakespeare has been, to a great degree, hidden over the centuries. It's the new attempt to come to terms with Shakespeare, this 400-year-old game of Shakespeare hide and seek, is now coming to fruition. And there's some very serious Shakespearean scholarship going on, which aims at ultimately coming to terms with who Shakespeare really was. And this continuing attempt to foist his achievement on some aristocrat, I think, is hogwash. It's gobbledygook. Shakespeare was an ordinary man. The attempt to denigrate Jefferson's notion that the ordinary man contains extraordinary possibilities is constantly being denigrated by the attempts to aristocraticize, if you will, Francis Bacon, Edward de Vere, Shakespeare. Shakespeare was a player, and the player wrote the plays. As a matter of fact, in The Rape of Lucrece, there is a line, only the vassal player is capable of transmitting the truth. That's where Shakespeare declares where he will go, where he will work from. That will be his station. That will be his working place. If he wishes to transmit the truth, he's going to have to do it as a player, and that, of course, includes as a playwright.
And that's where he was attacked, wasn't it, by Greene, Robert Greene. He put him down as a player.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
That very point.
Exactly. And I think Shakespeare was much more of a player than what we give him credit for having been. I think he played many varied roles. I think he played the major roles along with Burbage. I think he flipped back and forth playing Othello and Iago with Burbage, because there's no single other great tragic actor that is mentioned other than Burbage. Burbage is the only one that gets any kind of credit. There had to be another one. There's always two major roles in Shakespeare. Who's playing that other role? It's not Hemmings, it's not Condell. They play secondary, minor roles. We got Hemmings, as a matter of fact, playing the role of the nurse. Another notion in regard to the players, they were all capable of moving from one position to another in the plays, depending upon who the audience was, depending what the occasion was. Shakespeare played them like chess pieces. I think he was a very careful master of his craft, and he was a very careful editor of his work. I think he wrote his plays over and over and over again, right up until his final days. I think that when he retired to Stratford, he was pulling the folio finally together, and giving it then to his fellow players to make sure that it was published posthumously, but that it got published.
And his sonnets were published, what, 1609 or so?
1609. They came out, and of course they claimed that he had virtually nothing to do with it. It was surreptitiously published, but we have no way of knowing one way or another regarding that.
Back to the Stolen Kingdom in England. You have, I want you to outline a little bit what that was, because there's an extraordinary turmoil that he lived in, as you pointed out, and that is essentially the whole of the commons had been stolen. The religion had been stolen.
There were basically two things, two kinds of theft that were going on. There was the wars of succession, in which the aristocrats were constantly fighting over who should be royal, who should be king. There was that was going on, and that was creating, of course, a number of trips to the scaffold and drawings and quarterings. And then there was the dismantling of the established religion, which had been Roman Catholicism at that time. And then, of course, the Puritans as well, who were equally under the gun, or not equally, but were also under the gun in the Elizabethan age. So there were basically two wars going on and disrupting the society, two sets of poisons, if you will, both alike in dignity, ultimately end up destroying the younger generation. And Shakespeare had to deal with both of them. He mentions in the beginning of Romeo and Juliet two households. Those two households, I would imagine, sitting in an Elizabethan audience, you were hearing both the aristocratic wars that were going on and the religious wars that were going on. And they were destroying an entire generation of people, just as most wars do. I mean, it's usually the young that go off and fight the wars, right? That's who's over in Afghanistan right now and over in Iraq. And that's who will continue to be there apparently for some period of time, until we begin to recognize that war is the perpetuation of a stolen kingdom. And it poisons a society. It poisons a society that pursues it. If it's an aggressive war, it poisons a society that suffers it. Everyone then becomes basically a soldier home from the war suffering post-traumatic stress disorder. The Elizabethan age was an entire age suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of these two warring factions that were fighting either for the royal kingdom or fighting for their own particular religion, as it happens primarily Roman Catholicism.
We've both discussed this in the past, but the concept of psychopathology and the importance of us recognizing what psychopathology is. And in this context, Iago, for example, and there are many other villains who essentially Shakespeare plays as complicated evil, but evil. Mm-hmm. And it's a concept that our society disallows. We don't have the concept. We repress it as a concept of malignancy toward other people. And Shakespeare puts it on the table and says, you must look at this in order to understand your own society. How does that fit in with the universal stolen kingdom?
I think Shakespeare discovered not just the ruling theme of his own age, but I think in pursuing the stolen kingdom, I think he discovered that the rule rather than the exception is pathocracy. That's why power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so we have to be constantly wary of those whom we put in power. I think the Constitution and the American Revolution was fought and then dealt with in an attempt to shackle, put reins on power so that power could not lead us like it has done. Again, somehow it's been managed to be circumvented back into another world or a world at war, a world in which the kingdom is once again being poisoned. Take the profit motive out of war, and you might eventually get to the point where war is not going to at least exist as long as it has. This is what, the longest war in our history now? 10, 11 years. It's going into 11 years. Unbelievable. The number of people we've slain over there, unbelievable. And Shakespeare's theme, the stolen kingdom, addresses and readdresses and readdresses that, trying to basically cauterize the wound and end it, put an end to the poison kingdom, which, and I think, and this is an interesting idea that I had, there's been a couple of plays that have been essentially hidden for 400 years. And one of them is called Edmund Ironside. It was obviously a very early play, written very early, and only recently has it come to light that it could quite possibly, and accepted only by some scholars, quite possibly have been written by Shakespeare. Ironically, the major theme driving that play is the stolen kingdom, which makes me suspect that this might very well be a Shakespeare play. When you look at the language, the language indicates the words, the terminologies in the imagery indicate that it's very likely a Shakespeare play. Well, it's been hidden. Why? Well, for one reason, in that particular play, there are two royals vying for a kingdom, and they've gone to war. And the notion of the play suggests that you don't send people to a war. If you want to go to war, you fight the battle yourself. And the thing that makes it even more convincing that it's probably written by Shakespeare, and they have this in a library in London, is that they have a handwritten script. And the script, ironically, is in the same hand as Shakespeare's last will and testament. Now that means either Shakespeare's clerk wrote that play, Edmund Ironside, or Shakespeare himself wrote that play, and we do have one play completely in Shakespeare's hand that somehow they just weren't able to tuck away, they just weren't quite able to get rid of. And the reason that it's been in hiding, I think, is because it advocates if you want to go to war, you fight the battle. You two that want to fight this war, you're convinced it has to be done. Don't drag the innocent into it. Fight the battle yourselves. That the other end of the where I think that bookends the stolen theater theme, the stolen kingdom theme, is Cardenio, which just recently deciding that very possibly is written by Shakespeare as well. And it's the tale of a king who has fallen in love with a maiden who is not in love with him, but in love with Cardenio. And he insists that the maiden adhere to his wishes, and she commits suicide. Poison is put on her lips. The king takes the body of the woman and ravishes the body, implying that royalty, kingship, is a necrophiliac, which to King James who said the king had divine right, was probably the worst thing you possibly could have said to him. And that maybe is what leads Claire Asquith in Shadowplay to conclude that Shakespeare was banished to Stratford, and that play was only put on once. And then disappeared from view for 400 years. My notion of the Stolen Kingdom begins with Edmund Ironside and concludes with what I think is Shakespeare's last play, Cardenio. And I call on scholars the world over to take a look at that notion and see if it holds any water. Power apparently always somehow manages, if you don't keep it under some controls, always ends up in a pathocracy. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, as I said before.
Yeah, and that's a question I wanted to ask. You have Patrick Henry, and we're here at the Patrick Henry residence. Right. Henry famously recognized the threat of the British coming. They were in the ships. There were mercenaries heading, and he said, "There's no way to get around it. It's coming at us, and give me liberty or give me death." And the difference between our situation and then is that the enemy was recognized, and now we tend not to recognize the enemy. And the big crisis is that, and that's where Shakespeare's concept of pathocracy and pathocrats essentially.
Well, see, if media performed, our present media, right, performed the role that Shakespeare performed, which was to hold the mirror up to nature, to speak truth to power. If we speak truth to power now, we end up in prison. Shakespeare dared, he had to do it very carefully, he had to be very subtle about it, but Shakespeare managed nonetheless to speak truth to power. Our media, unfortunately, does not have the courage or the integrity, or they are tied too tightly into corporatism or the ruling pathocracy, that make to tell the truth about who we are, where we're going, and what its ultimate effects are. And Shakespeare, of course, is probably revered as much as for any other reason, because he managed to do that in a very complicated, very troubled, very pathological time. Two different ages, two kings, to royalty, to the aristocracy, to the groundlings, and he managed, and he could only manage it by being a playwright and an actor. That's the only way he could talk to the entire society. He had the ability to move through the entire society unshackled, because he was just too intelligent to be shackled. They attempted in several occasions in several ways to tongue-tie him. And he talks about being tongue-tied by authority, but he was not tongue-tied. One of the brilliant ways that he handled that was you weren't allowed to put an aristocrat or royalty on stage. And so he managed to avoid that by combining them on stage. In other words, you couldn't put Edward de Vere on stage. You could be drawn and quartered for that. You couldn't put Robert Devereux on stage. You could be drawn and quartered by that. But you could slam the two of them together, given the characteristics of both, and all you'd have was an argument about which one it was. And since it was both, it was neither. And that way he was able to put his own time on dramatic trial by hiding them in plain sight. A brilliant notion. And when you see this whole notion of making the two one, which is essentially what the Hendiadys is, and I take that as the kernel of all of Shakespeare's work, his whole oeuvre, if you will, is the Hendiadys, which means making one out of two. And if you take a look at that, he did that with his plots, he did that with his characters, he did that with historical time periods, the essential essence of Shakespeare, and he makes that very clear in The Phoenix and the Turtle, when he talks about making the two one. He tells you in that cryptic philosophical poem that what he's doing is making the two one. Biblically, I am the way, the truth, and the life is a Hendiadys. It puts together, what it basically does is it takes what is usually a subordinate notion and it equalizes it with, it takes an adjective and it makes it into a noun. In other words, it democratizes. It democratizes what is a higher and a lower, what is an adjective in our ordinary notion is elevated and with a conjunction and, it's combined, I am the way and the truth and the life. It combines it and it equalizes it, which creates a kind of catharsis, because we're not used to having things equalized. We're not used to the low becoming equal with the high.
How was Shakespeare regarded? Was he well-renowned during his time, or did he play a low key in order to?
It's so hard to know, because the Puritans took over after when along came Charles II, Charles I, and then of course later Charles II, and of course they executed Charles I. But the Puritans sort of took over and cleaned house, and so we don't really know fully. We know that he was respected by many, and we know that he put on plays for royalty. There are records of that, and put on plays for the aristocracy and individual aristocratic houses. We know that. But he seemed to shun personal individuals' fame. That's, I think, given evidence in that he waited until after his death to have his plays published posthumously. I think he wanted the play to be the thing. And when he says that, the play is the thing in Hamlet, I think that who I am is unimportant, who I am is insignificant. The significant thing is my body of work. Know me through my plays. And Hemmings and Condell, in making the edition of the folio in 1623, make that point. Come to know the author by his work. By his
and
plays.
Others had suffered severely. I mean, Marlowe, by making himself known. So.
And Shakespeare had to do that. He had to be low-key in order to do what he wanted to do. The Shakespearean intention, which was to change the entire structure of that society. If I'm reading it correctly with the Stolen Kingdom theme.
Talking about reshaping and remaking that society, the concept of language. I mean, much of our language, the written language, is Shakespearean.
Oh,
and it's just extraordinary.
Shakespeare owns us. It's the ruling language of the world.
The Gospel of Thomas. Would you expand on that in terms of its relevance to Shakespeare?
Okay, the Gospel of Thomas was discovered in the Dead Sea Scrolls in the last century. It's only a recent discovery. And the Gospel of Thomas is among those. We have hints and whispers of it in the King James Bible, but we don't have that actual parable, if you will, or that poem parable, which in many ways echoes and reflects upon and mutually reinforces the phoenix and the turtle. It's almost as though the two knew each other. Anyway, in that particular parable, Christ is talking to Thomas, and a woman is suckling a child. And Christ looks over and says, "Oh, that reminds me of how one may enter the kingdom." And Thomas says, "Tell us, Lord, how do we enter the kingdom?" And he begins with then the parable, when you make the two one. And then he goes on, he goes through a series of images, one of which is at the very center of it, when you make eyes in the place of an eye. Now he begins with the principle, when you make the two one, but at the very center of the poem, he says, when you make the one two, which is an interesting paradox, an interesting, almost seemingly a contradiction. But when he says, when you make the two one, he says, when you make the above as the below. In other words, that's the hendiadys. That's the principle of equalization. That's the principle of democracy.
Egalitarianism, essentially.
Yeah, egalitarianism, essentially. And that is the principle that Shakespeare built his entire body of work. So if you take those two poems and you compare them with each other, a poem parable and the phoenix and the turtle, I think you discover something close to the heart of Shakespeare and something close to the heart of Christ. They connect. They connect in a very fundamental, foundational, philosophical, very profound way. And then when you see that basically what Shakespeare was doing with his plays was working through that parable, basically undergoing, it's a parable of transformation. Actually, it's a parable of transfiguration. If you go through all the imagery of the parable, one of the key lines in it is that when you make an image in the place of an image, in other words, when you transform whatever image that is ruling your psyche into an image in relation to the entire notion of the poem, you enter the kingdom, because it's all about Lord, how do we enter the kingdom? And that's not in the any of the Bibles, any of the various Bibles. That's left out.
Is that similar to what Julian Jaynes has in mind when he talks about the power of the metaphor? Because essentially you've developed
you could say that.
A more complicated, higher metaphor in order to understand.
You could say that. You could say that. You could say that thinking metaphorically is essentially is the essential part of our humanity. That we have to become capable of thinking metaphorically, not literally, metaphorically. And Shakespeare's entire body of work is built on metaphor. The ultimate metaphor in the human condition, the ultimate coming together of the ultimate making the two one, is Christ coming to earth. That's the ultimate hendiadys in terms of an action. Now, ordinarily, it's just thought of as an individual figure of speech. But then that takes you to his poem on Anne Hathaway, which he talks about Anne Hathaway being heaven on earth in that particular poem. Basically, he gives her a hendiadic structure, a hendiadic dimension. He makes the two one in that regard. And it's interesting that when you tie that in with Shakespeare's depiction of the woman, probably more than anyone else in the human condition, Shakespeare freed the woman from her position of being led to the burnings, the witch burnings that went on for 1,000 years in Europe. I think he discovered the ultimate stolen kingdom. The ultimate stolen kingdom has been up until our present time, and I think Desdemona points that out. Desdemona is the stolen kingdom in Othello. She is strangled by Othello by virtue of Iago's promptings. Desdemona, by the way, means desired by demons, if you interpret it in terms of what it etymologically means.
And she had no prior existence in any literature, Desdemona. It's a
No,
Shakespearean.
as far as I know, I think the name may have existed somewhere, but if it does, or if it has, I'm not aware of it. Here's a curious notion that probably some will take considerable umbrage with. Shakespeare, in his will, leaves the gatehouse to a John Robinson. Now, the assumption is that, well, John Robinson was harboring priests there and protecting those who were being pursued by the authorities. And I think that's partly true. But no one's ever been able to come up with specifically who John Robinson really was. And when you discover that he's given this gatehouse for 6 pence a year for as many years as he wants it, and he's still there in 1631. There's a record of him still being there 15 years later, still having occupancy of Shakespeare's gatehouse, his most expensive property, which is in London. It is on the Thames River. You wonder, well, who is this John Robinson? And then you find that in Amsterdam, there is a very famous minister who sets out and plans the whole separatist movement of coming to America over on the Mayflower. He was the essential inspirer of the journey to America. It's just possible that the whole American notion is Shakespearean. It's just possible with his language and with it's just possible John Robinson was working for Shakespeare. We have no better notion of who he was. He doesn't come. His son then comes afterward. He stays in Holland for one reason or another, in Amsterdam. And the other separatists, of course, come, and a number of them lose their lives, and then they go on, and ultimately the Mayflower Compact, and ultimately the Pequot War, and the French and Indian War, and King Philip's War, and all the events that ultimately lead up to the American Revolution. But it's just possible that the whole democratic notion goes all the way back to the Shakespearean Hendiadys. It's just possible that it begins there when you make the above as the below, when you make the two one. And that then takes a jump, a 2,000-year jump back to Shakespeare's, or to Christ's 22nd Gospel, according to Thomas. You enter the kingdom when you make the two one.
When you look at Merchant of Venice, can you expand on how the stolen kingdom fits into that concept?
But it fits very, very well. There is a stolen kingdom there, and of course, the one that is attempting to steal and then ends up getting stolen from, of course, is the Merchant of Venice. Is what's his name?
Shylock?
Shylock, right? And of course. So the whole thing is built upon a theft, which ultimately backs up, doubles back on Shylock, who wants the pound of flesh, and of course can't have it unless he commits murder, and then he has to pay for the murder. As I recall, you can't cut away a pound of flesh without destroying the person that's carrying that pound of flesh.
How was that play received in London during Shakespeare's time?
Apparently it went very well. I'm not sure that it played a number of times. I'm not sure how they reacted to Shylock, because a jury, as of course you knew, was not accepted in England at the time. It was very rare that there were some among the aristocracy. There were some royal musicians who were Italian or Spanish Jews and so on. But the whole notion, the quality of mercy is not strained, that informs that play when she lets Shylock go, when she has him as a result of his treachery and his unreasonableness in seeking a pound of flesh. But you can see how the Poison Kingdom theme ties very much into that play as well. And of course, Romeo and Juliet, and on and on and on. There's no ending to
Richard II in an odd sort of
all the history plays are basically succession wars that lead to deaths and the destruction of the innocent, as all wars do, as all stolen kingdoms do. The society gets poisoned.
What are the best portraits of Shakespeare in your view?
Well, that's an ongoing controversy and has been ongoing for now 400 years. And it's probably going to continue. They've trotted out a new picture now that they claim is really a picture, a portrait of Shakespeare. I don't happen to go along with that. I think they're hiding any of the true portraits from life, and the one I think that is authentic is the chess players. And they apparently are writers, because in the background are pen and ink, two sets of pen and ink with one page crumpled, the other page not. And the one is dressed in a costume of a Spaniard, and the other one is dressed in a costume of a sort of an ordinary man. And if you look at it carefully, you see that the one character looks like Shakespeare and is in fact depicting Don Armado. Apparently the picture, a young man, in 1604 that was painted. You can see that the Don Armado is checkmating the other character. The other character appears to be Ben Jonson. We only have one portrait of Ben Jonson, and this looks like Ben Jonson as a young man, and this character is caricatured, and he's just throwing his hands up in the air, and indicating that he's just lost the chess match. That's Shakespeare and Ben Jonson, the two playwrights. Portrait of Shakespeare in 1588 as a young man at the age of 24. The hand is obviously a woman's hand, and the age must have taken it metaphorically to mean holding the hand of Queen Elizabeth, who was the royalty of the time, but it represents symbolically any number of very special hands which are at the center of Shakespeare. That's from Romeo and Juliet, Zeffirelli's film production. It's the love song when Juliet and Romeo meet for the first time, and it's love at first sight, you would call that scene, one of the most moving scenes in all of literature.
From my lips, by thine, my sin is purged.
Then have my lips a sin that they have took?
Sin from my lips? Oh, trespass sweetly urged. Give me my sin again.
A rose will bloom, it then will fade, so does the youth, so does